Hello, welcome to this communication awareness training. This training today is recorded so that you can access it at any time and pause it. The training is a general communication awareness session, so it's not specific for any one service user, but hopefully it'll be helpful for people who are working directly or indirectly supporting people with a learning disability. So if we quickly introduce ourselves, I'll start. My name is Corinne Simpson. I'm a speech and language therapist. Helen?
Hi, I'm Helen. I'm a speech and language therapist in the Community Durham LD teams currently.
Hi, I'm Alana. I'm also a speech and language therapist, and I also work in the Community LD team at the minute.
Yeah, so we all work for TZESC and Wear Valleys NHS Trust. So if we go on to the next slide, just a few kind of housekeeping things. Obviously this is recorded, so you can access it at any time. Feel free to pause at any time and to take a break if you need, or there will be a couple of activities throughout where it might be more convenient just for you to pause it and take time to reflect or discuss with colleagues, maybe think about particular people that you've worked with in the past. Make sure you've got enough time to watch the video, but as I say, feel free to come back if you don't have enough time. Make sure you've got the workbook and a pen with you handy. If you don't, go and grab it, and there'll be activities throughout which we're referring to within the workbook. The activities will take around maybe 5 minutes each, but obviously it's up to you. You can go as quickly or as slowly as you want with those activities, and as I say, feel free to discuss with colleagues. Make sure you've got a quiet environment, maybe pop on some headphones, and if you see the pause symbol, that's when we'll kind of prompt you to pause it for the activities. So just a few things to be aware of before we start. Okay. So this is what we will be covering in this session. We'll be talking about what is a learning disability, different from learning difficulty, just to point out at the start. What is communication? We'll be talking about the means, reasons and opportunities model, which is something we often refer to in our assessment and going forward with interventions. We'll be thinking about what does expressive communication mean, what does that look like, and it could be very different for lots of different people. Receptive communication, communication breakdowns, what can cause that, what can help, things that we can do to help, any strategies or interventions we can put in place, and also thinking about some different communication approaches as well. So, what is a learning disability? So I did say already that it's different from a learning difficulty. So a learning disability is a reduced intellectual ability and difficulty with everyday activities which affects someone for their whole life. And so it's not something that they're going to kind of overcome in a couple of years or anything like that. It's something that is with someone for life. People with a learning disability tend to take longer to learn things. They might need support to develop new skills, understand complicated information, and interact with other people. And these are all areas where speech and language can support with. It's not to say that someone with a learning disability can't learn. They absolutely can. They just might need more support and more time in different ways. The level of support absolutely depends on the individual. There's no such thing as one learning disability. Every individual is different. So, you know, you might say someone potentially has a mild learning disability, or, you know, it really just depends on the person and how much support they might want or need. And people with certain specific conditions can also have a learning disability that co-occurs alongside that. So for example, people with Down syndrome or some people with autism might also have a learning disability as well. And I think it's just worth saying that, you know, if someone's got a learning disability, they might still have things like jobs, education, things like that, but it's just about how much support and reasonable adjustments we need to make to enable that person to fulfill lots of areas within, you know, their life, and also alongside any physical disabilities as well, which is something different and again very individual to the person. So if we have a look at the next slide, and this is just a little statistic saying that 90% of people with learning disability have communication difficulties, and that's from the British Institute of Learning Disabilities. And so there's a really, really high chance that if you're working with someone who does have a learning disability, they will have some type of communication need, whether that's in relation to their expressive language, and so their ability to voice their opinions and really make their needs and wants known, or in terms of their receptive language, so their ability to understand. And sometimes we might overestimate or underestimate both, but it's really can be a spectrum of difficulties depending on the person. So if we go to the next slide, these are just a couple of things that we might hear quite often about someone with a learning disability, and it's not to say that these are kind of coming from a bad place or anything like that, but hopefully by the end of the session we might have changed your mind if these are some opinions that you might have previously thought of before. So people might think that oh yeah, he understands absolutely everything I say. Again, we'll go through this later on throughout the session. She's got selective hearing, it's a behaviour, he's being lazy, and they're doing it just to get some attention, she's awkward or stubborn or difficult, or they'll just do what they want to do. So yeah, again, they're not coming from a bad place. It's more about the level of understanding about someone's communication, and that, as I say, is different from person to person. So we'll think about some of these kind of ideas throughout the session. So what is communication? Communication is a two-way process, and you can't communicate by yourself, and it's where messages are sent and understood between individuals or groups of people. So people in societies have developed common languages so that they can live together with a shared means of communication. And I think within that, you've got those important words that really highlight that it is a two-way process. So you've got common languages. So if I don't speak the same language that you speak, we're not going to be able to communicate. And it's a shared means of communication. So there isn't just all the responsibility or focus just on the one person. It really has to be shared and balanced between two or more people. And shared communication is fundamental to being included in society. Spoken and written language are highly valued means of communication, but research shows that 93% of communication is non-verbal. So I think this is a really, really important thing as well. Within our society, we really value certain types of communication, perhaps more than others, without fully appreciating maybe that there's lots of other ways that we communicate ideas without even thinking about it, and we might take that for granted. But when it comes to some of the service users that we might be working with, they might be more comfortable or more reliant using other methods of communication, and that's not to say that that's bad or less valued, it's just different. But yeah, so for example, non-verbal communication like facial expression, for example. So we've got an activity here. So with this, it's in the workbook in section 1. And we're going to be thinking about how you would describe a picture without speaking, without using words, or writing it down. So it can be a little bit of a daunting task maybe at first, but you're doing it in pairs. So yeah, try and kind of share that responsibility. It's not just you doing it. You've got to share that with your partner. And there's some reflection questions as well in the handbook. So yeah, it looks at how we're not just relying on speech every day. We're using lots of other ways. Once you've done this, as I say, have a look at the questions and reflect on the activity. So if you'd like to pause it here, and then we can come back in the next section. Okay, and then take turns with your partner and pause it again for this one. Okay, now I'll pass over to Alana.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about the means, reasons and opportunities model. So this model is what we base a lot of our assessment and interventions on. So all three of these areas are needed for successful communication to occur. So the part in the middle represents when all of these areas come together, and that's to allow for successful communication. So we're going to have a look at each of these areas individually. My slides are stuck.
I think if we've got the pause symbol there, so
yeah,
if you want to pause here and maybe have a think about the different means of communicating. So how can we get our message across, not just using speech, but thinking about lots of other ways, be creative, think outside the box. But if you pause the video and have a look at section 2 of the workbook, and try and write down as many ideas as you can for how we would communicate an idea that you can think of. You could just write it kind of around the circle if that's easier. And give yourself a few minutes to pause it here. Again, talk with your colleagues, have a think about it, and then unpause the video when you're ready.
Okay, so now that you've completed that activity, we're going to look at the different ways in which we communicate. So this is considering the means aspect of the model that we just looked at. So we've different means of communicating, that is verbal and non-verbal. And this is what's called our expressive communication. So expressive communication is to do with getting our message across. So there's lots of different ways to do this. So we have verbal means and non-verbal means. So you can see here under the verbal means, that's things like words and sentences, intonation. So that's kind of like the pitch of our voice, the speed, the loudness, inflections, and pitch there as well. We also have non-verbal means of communication. So that's kind of anything bar speech. So we have writing, we've pictures, photos, symbols, objects, things like gesture. Some people use sign-in, so things like Makaton. We also have things like our body language, our posture, our facial expressions, our behavior and our vocalizations. So there's lots of different ways that we can communicate. So people say that 93% of all communication is non-verbal. So this is kind of really interesting if we think about it, because a lot of us would say that verbal communication is probably the most common way of communicating, but there are lots of non-verbal ways that we can communicate. So just to give you an example, using sarcasm when we speak gives little meaning in a sentence, and you need to think about the context and the tone. So hopefully you'll have used some of these non-verbal means of communication during the activity where you were describing the picture. Okay, so now we're going to think about the reasons that people communicate. So have a quick think about why you might want or need to communicate with someone. So again, if you pause the video for a few minutes, write down your ideas in the reasons circle, and that's in section 2 of your workbook. So if you pause, have a think about it, and then come back. So if we think about the reasons that we communicate, we're going to show you some pictures now, and we want you to try and identify what the reason is for communicating in each picture. So look at the next page of your workbook and write your thoughts down here. And then we will come back. Okay, so the first, if we look at the first picture, and think about the reasons that this lady is communicating. So if you want to pause the video here, have a think about it. So then when you come back, this lady is obviously trying to greet someone, or she may be trying to gain attention. So that kind of was her reason for communicating in this picture. So if we move on to the next one then, and if you have a think about why these ladies might be communicating. So again, they might be having a chat, they might be catching up, they look like friends. Now if we think about the next picture, so again, the reasons here for communicating, this lady looks a bit lost, she looks like she's maybe asking for directions, so that could be her possible reason for communicating here. This one, if you think about this one, it looks like the man in the blue hat is possibly giving the man in the white hat some directions or instructions. So again, that's another reason for communicating. If you think about the lady in this picture, she certainly looks a bit confused. She looks like she wants to ask a question, so she might need help. She might need some clarification. So that could possibly be her reason for communicating. So if we think about this picture, we can see that the guy in this picture has turned his head away. He clearly doesn't want to eat what he's being offered. So his reason for communicating here is that he's saying, I don't want what's on that plate. The next slide then, we have two individuals here who look very angry. So we can see that the guy on the left has his hand raised, the guy on the right has his hand raised to his head. So their reasons for communicating again could be frustration, they might be angry. So again, all possible reasons for communication here. So if we look at this nice picture, we can see that the little boy in this picture is possibly making a decision here about what he wants to eat. So he's choosing between the cupcake and the apple, and he's making a very clear decision here that he's opting for the cupcake. So that's his reasons for communication in this one. And then the last picture here, we can see two people in this picture are laughing. So their reason for communication here might be they've told each other a joke, they might be laughing at a funny story. So all of these, again, reasons for communication here. So you will probably have seen some of these reasons for communicating in the pictures. So the message here is that there are lots of reasons for communicating. Some are to meet very basic needs like getting food, using the toilet. However, some are more complex. So like expressing how you're feeling, or simply just wanting to have a chat for the sake of chatting. And that would be essentially meeting your social needs, which we all have. So for individuals with communication difficulties, it can sometimes be very hard to meet these more complex needs if they or their carers don't have the skills or tools to facilitate this. So opportunities for communicating include where we are, when in the day we're with, and who we communicate with. So as carers of individuals with learning disabilities, with communication difficulties, it can often be our responsibility to create these opportunities for communication. Okay, so we now want you to have a think about opportunities. So again, if you write down some specific opportunities that you might have given your service users to communicate. So again, if you pause the video for a few minutes and write your thoughts down in section 2 of your workbook. So just to quickly summarise what we've talked through, the means, reasons and opportunities model. We have the means, so this is how we communicate, how we get our message across. We have our reason, so this is why we communicate, you know, whether it be, you know, to meet those basic needs or the more complex needs that we discussed. And then we have the opportunity, so this is where, when and who we communicate with. So just to finish off, this is just a nice little kind of diagram of what we've talked about, and it summarises how we communicate. So through speech and writing, the reasons we communicate, and again the opportunity. So that's where, when and who we communicate with. And we have successful communication in the middle here, which is kind of when all 3 areas come together. So it's important to let other people know when you do find things out, so that other people can give the same opportunities for communication and sharing what is effective for that particular individual that you're working with. So I'll pass you on to Helen.
It's me having this bit, right, Helen?
Oh, it's my mistake. I'll pass you back to Corin.
Unless you want to do it, Helen. No. Yes, so obviously talking about means, reasons and opportunities, as Alana's just said, it's really, really important to pass over that information about that specific service user across, you know, the whole team, anybody working with that service user, alongside the means, reasons and opportunities model. There are other things that might affect this person's communication, and again, this can be different day to day in different settings with different partners, so it's really important to be aware of these things for that individual. And you might do that kind of through handover, through case notes, through just the file, or things like a communication passport, sorry. But factors that could affect communication could be hearing. So if somebody is very prone to a waxy buildup in their ears, it might be that that person just can't hear you. It's not that they're ignoring you, they don't understand you, they just can't hear you. So yeah, this is things like getting regular health checks is really important for physical things like this, just to rule out, it's really important. Somebody's vision. So if somebody's, I don't know, if their vision is impaired or they're long-sighted or short-sighted, being aware of things like that. If you're showing them visuals, photos, objects, writing, even recognizing faces. So going up to someone saying, hi, it's so-and-so, or just things like that about building relationships. If you're not regularly working with that person, just little things like that that could affect how that person communicates with you, maybe that you maybe just haven't thought about, you know, if their vision is affecting them. And their memory, so if they are, I don't know, if it's an elderly person or there's queries around dementia or things like this, their memory about their life and life events and what's happened to them and where they are now. So things like memory books or photos might be a nice option. But obviously that's going to have an impact on communication. If they're wanting to have the same conversations, for some staff that might be quite frustrating or annoying. Why are they constantly talking about the same thing? But yeah, just being aware of that maybe. Someone's past experience. So if, I don't know, maybe certain topics of conversation are particularly traumatic, or there's certain, I don't know, words that should be avoided because they're particularly distressing for that person from their history, and being aware of that. I mean, I'll quickly whiz through the rest of them, but this is just to give you an idea. So yeah, attention and concentration. Can that person attend to a long conversation with lots of people in the room, or does it have to be short instructions, one-to-one, broken down? Communication partners, are they more comfortable or familiar with certain people? Quite likely most people are, so being aware of who that person is. The environment, if it's a very busy environment or very noisy, there's lots of distractions going on. Physical health, if the person's really poorly, they just might not be up to it, but usually they are. So just being aware of that. So, you know, when I feel poorly, sometimes I just want to be left alone. Sometimes I just, you know, can't be bothered. So I think it's just being sympathetic to their health at that time. Mood or anxiety, as I say, people, you know, everyone has moods, and sometimes you might be in the mood for communication, sometimes you might not be. And so again, just knowing that person really well to know their signs of when they are up to it and when they're not. Their motivation, knowing what's really interesting for that person, topics of conversation or things that can help get them on board. And again, that's just down to people who know them really well. Yep, familiarity. If I'm not familiar with you, I might not be communicating in my best way, just like you might not be if you're not familiar with me. And shared means of communication. So if I go up to someone and start speaking Spanish and they don't speak Spanish, or if I start speaking English and they don't speak English, we're not going to be able to communicate using that language. So we need a shared means of communication, and that could be Makaton, it could be objects, it could be symbols, it could be verbal, but just broken down really simply into keywords. So we need to know what that shared means of communication is for that one person. And what happens if communication is not successful? So if we've done our best, we've considered their health, their mood, you know, a shared means of communication, and it's still not successful, then this person is going to have some difficulties making friends and building relationships. And it might be that they can start relationships, but they can't maintain them. That could be difficult for that person. And they might have difficulties making choices. And that could be really simple choices, like what are they going to have for dinner? Or it could be really important choices, like where am I going to live? What's my care going to look like? So, you know, throughout the levels, that could be have a big impact on their life. If someone's not communicating successfully, they might have difficulties learning, and they might need to learn different things throughout their life, to build skills, to learn new things. So we need to be communicating in an accessible way for them, to support them to learn. Difficulties expressing feelings, thoughts and emotions, and that's hard for anybody. But for someone with a learning disability or someone who has communication difficulties, that might just be a bit more tricky. So we need to consider that. And also they might have some difficulties making sense just of the world around them, you know, where they are, what's going on, who are all these people, and if we're not communicating in a shared way, then that could be quite distressing and yeah, not very nice for some people. So if we're thinking about all of these things, you might have seen this before, but thinking about behaviours that might be seen as difficult or behaviours that might be perceived as challenging, we can link this with communication and kind of think about how how behaviour is a type of communication. So this person might not be able to verbally express what's going on, but if we see this behaviour, we can kind of work out other things going on in the environment, and potentially put that down to some sort of communication breakdown. So we've got this kind of circle and it can go either way. So you have a communication breakdown for whatever reason, which leads to frustration, naturally, and then it can either go to that person becoming quite withdrawn, or it can lead to that person becoming aggressive. And ultimately, they could both lead to a behaviour that's labelled as challenging. So they might have violent outbursts, they might have self-injurious behaviour and self-stimulatory behaviour, and we need to really think, what is causing this person to go through all this extra effort and all this difficulty and distress, and why are they doing this? What's causing this? Not always, but sometimes it's linked to communication breakdowns. So that's something that we just really need to be aware of. And I think, am I passing over to Helen now? No, sorry, I'm a slide ahead. Yeah, so yeah, as I said, the behaviours, they're not premeditated, they're not designed to upset. It's not this person is doing it on purpose to really annoy me or be difficult. But when we're in that situation as staff or carers or family, it can be really hard to kind of step back and not think that. So I think our emotional response, we might need time to reflect about it or talk it through with someone to really think step by step what's happening and what can we do to avoid this in future. But the emotional response within us might make us think that they are just doing it on purpose. They're just doing it to wind us up. They're doing it for attention, but they're not. That's just our emotional response at the time. So although it's difficult when you're in the situation, it's worth, if you can, stepping back later, asking yourself, why are they going through all this effort, showing this behaviour? What's going on? What's the function of the behaviour? Why are they doing it? To make their needs known, and maybe we need to support them with another way to show that. So that's where kind of communication would step in, and we need to support them with other methods of communication rather than this behaviour, which is labelled as challenging. And now I'll pass over to Helen. Sorry.
Thanks, Corinne. If anyone needs a break, now might be a good time to pause for a little bit before we start this new section. But I'm going to take you to the end of this part of the training. So the training is in two parts. I'm going to take you to the end of this first bit. So what we're going to talk about now is some terms that you might hear us use quite often. And I think Alana's touched on them already. So we have got expressive communication and we've got receptive communication. So expressive communication is somebody expressing themselves, so their output. And people might have difficulties with this. But then we also have receptive communication, which is understanding, our understanding of things. So understanding our input, and people might have difficulties with those as well. People may also have difficulties with both their expressive and both their receptive communication. But we'll go into detail for each in a minute. So if we start with expressive communication. So people with learning disabilities may have difficulties getting their message across. so their output. And there might be a few reasons or a few difficulties why they might struggle with this. So the first one, their speech might be unclear. So they might be getting all the letters in the wrong place. They might not be able to move their mouth to form the sounds quite right. So as a communication partner, we might struggle to understand their speech. We often find, however, that the carers, the family or the paid staff who spend a lot of time with these service users, they can tune in. So over time, they can tune in. But if an unfamiliar person then comes in, they might have difficulties understanding this unclear speech. Our service users, they might have difficulties finding that right word. So I know we all do this at times. We all say, oh, what's that word? I can't think of that word. But our service users might find this a lot more difficult. So they really cannot find that word. However much prompting we give, they really struggle to find that word. Some of our service users, they might struggle to put words together. So they might just speak using one word, and that's okay, but they might struggle to make a cohesive sentence like we speak in. They might also use the other forms of communication that are at the bottom. So not even a word, it might be a vocalization. It might be those non-verbal means of communication. So they might gesture, they might point, they might need pictures, objects. Like Corinne has spoken about, behaviour. Behaviour is a means of communication. So we need to kind of acknowledge that and respect that they are trying to communicate something through that behaviour. And as communication partners, it's up to us to kind of tune in to their means of communication. And the last one, just going back up, people might talk a lot but doesn't carry any meaning, which I think is on the next slide, Alana. So learnt phrases. So some of our service users, they might talk a lot and they might make sentences, but actually when you pick it a little bit, they might not actually be saying much. They might just be copying back what we've said or what they've heard. So sometimes these are called learnt phrases. So they give the impression that the person has quite a lot of language, more than they actually do. But actually, when you unpick it, they've just heard it and they're just repeating it. So they've learnt that phrase and they're using that phrase. You know, they might tell a joke. So they give the appearance that they have this language, they know this joke, but actually they don't understand what the joke actually means. They've just heard it and they're just using it. So just be aware, the phrase itself might be meaningless to the person. They might not actually understand the words, the content of that phrase. They might have heard it and are using it. Sometimes our service users use those learnt phrases in exactly the right place. You know, they use it in the right, after the right question, in the right context, but it might just be something they've heard and are copying back without understanding it. Okay, so if you just want to have a think now, so what challenges might someone have if they have difficulties with their expressive language? So have a think about service users that you work with. Think about what are the challenges if they're struggling to communicate and express themselves. What challenges are they going to come across? Just have a pause to think about that. Okay, so you might have come up with some of these. So if somebody struggles to express themselves, they might have difficulties interacting with someone. So Corinne's spoken about having that shared communication, that shared language. If we don't have that shared language, they're not going to be able to interact very well. So if I use Makaton as my primary form of communication, but Alana doesn't know Makaton, that I'm not going to be able to interact with Alana that successfully. So interaction, our social interaction might be impacted. Might not be able to participate fully in activities. So if they go to day service and they do a quiz, that's quite a verbal activity. But again, if I'm non-verbal and I use British Sign Language and my communication partners don't know British Sign Language, I'm not going to be able to participate in that activity if my communication partners don't know my means of communication. Difficulty conveying my needs and my wants. So if I don't have a way of telling you I need the toilet or I'm hungry, my basic needs might not be met. Difficulty making choices. So in that picture that Alana showed, the boy with a cake and the boy with an apple, if I don't have any shared means of communication to make that choice, for example, if I use eye gaze to communicate, but you've not realised that, you're not going to know what I want. So you might give me the apple, and actually I don't want that apple, I want that cake, but I've just know I'm struggling to express that to you. So it might go, it might lead to me getting things that I don't want really, but I'm struggling to say that to you, to communicate that with you. I might become dependent on other people anticipating my needs. So if, again, going back to the examples of if I need the toilet or if I'm hungry, if I'm struggling to express that to you, it might become dependent on my carers to anticipate it and just give me a drink every hour or so, which reduces my independence and reduces my opportunity to communicate in the means, reasons, opportunity model that Alana said. With all those things, then I might start to become a bit withdrawn and a bit bored, a bit uncooperative. If I'm struggling to express myself, I might just stop trying. If it's unsuccessful communication every time I try to express myself, I might just withdraw and I might become kind of isolated, bored or uncooperative. So like Corinne suggested about the behaviours, I might become uncooperative and it might reflect in my behaviours as well, because I'm struggling to express my needs and my wants. Okay, so our service users, they struggle to express themselves. What can we do to help? And these are just general strategies at this stage. In the second part of the training, we will talk about more intervention, more therapy in depth. But these are just general strategies that anyone can use. You might already use them, which is brilliant. So, service user is struggling to express themselves. What can we do? We can find out how they communicate. Have they seen speech and language before in the past? Is there a report from speech and language therapy? Can we dig that out and find out, what they assessed last time? So as I mentioned before, if I'm using Makaton, Alana doesn't know Makaton, Alana can find out that I use Makaton, and then maybe her service could look into some Makaton training. So that's a really good kind of a way to help. We always talk about accepting, valuing and responding to all means of communication. So in that means, reasons, opportunities model, there was verbal means and there was non-verbal means. And we always say to accept any form of communication. So don't put pressure on people using verbal. Don't put pressure on them saying it. If they've communicated it through their body language, through gesture, through vocalization, that is communication. So please accept that just as much as a verbal communication. Any form of communication is what we aim for. And if they have communicated it, don't make them communicate it again, just for the sake of it. So accept and value every form of communication. Make sure their means of communication are available. So if they are, if they're using PECs, or if they're using visuals, objects, or if they've got a high-tech communication aid, make sure it's available. So don't leave it on the bus or leave it in the bedroom. Make sure it's available, because if they don't have it available, they're going to struggle to get their means of communication across. Give the person plenty of time. So our service users with learning disabilities, they might need more time to process than we do, more time to join those words together and put those words together into a sentence than we do. So give them plenty of time to communicate. Just take a pause after a question and don't expect an answer straight away. Give them some time. Create an appropriate environment. So Corinne spoke about the other factors that affect communication. If that environment is really noisy, really busy, they might struggle to get their message across if they're not heard, if they're distracted by all the other things. If there's too much sensory input, they might struggle to concentrate on getting that message across. And we all have that sometimes. If there's a lot going on around us, it can be difficult to concentrate on one thing in particular. So just keep it nice and calm and nice and quiet as much as possible. Obviously, we understand we're not always all in a very quiet environment, so it's not feasible 24/7. But as much as possible, just keep that environment nice and calm and nice and quiet. And learn how the person communicates. So like I said right at the beginning, finding out how they communicate. Speak that same language. So if I use Makaton, please use Makaton back with me. If I use Makaton and you're talking to me verbally and I'm deaf, for example, I'm not gonna get that verbal communication. That isn't going to be a shared language between us. So please pick up on the shared language and use that shared language with the service user. Okay, so that's all been talking about expressive communication. So how our service users get their message across, their output. Next section that you might hear us talking about is understanding of language. So our service users might have difficulties understanding what is said to them. Okay, so just a bit of an example. So let's imagine it's dinner time. You can smell the food cooking. You can hear the sound of the table being set. Then your carer comes in, points to the door and says, go downstairs to the dining room. How many words in that sentence do you think that the person needs to understand in order to follow that instruction? So just have a think about that for a second. Just have a read over it again. And how many words does that person need to understand in order to follow that instruction? Okay. The answer, oh, just go back one, sorry, Alana. The answer is actually no, none, sorry. It's actually none. There's lots of other environmental cues that the person can pick up on. So they might be feeling hungry. So they might think, oh, it must be coming up to dinner time. So it's an internal feeling hungry. They can smell that food cooking. So that is a really strong environmental cue that it's coming up to dinner time. You can hear the sound of the table being set. So again, that's another environmental cue. Our table's being set. That means dinner time. And then over experience, with past experience, again, like Corinne mentioned about the other factors that affect communication, our past experience has taught us if the table's being set, that means it's a meal time. So we've learned that. Carer comes in and points to the door. So we might look at that point and we can follow that point to where they're going. So actually, I might not need to understand any of it. I know I can smell it, I can hear it, and my carer's pointed to the door. So I've put all those environmental cues together, and from a past experience, I know that it's dinner time. So the next example, so now let's imagine you're in the kitchen. In the sink, there's knives, forks, different size spoons. The cutlery is usually kept in the drawer, and then your carer says, get a knife and a big spoon from the sink. So have a think about this example. How many words do we need to understand in this sentence to follow that instruction, to carry that out? Okay, so in this one, you need to understand 4 words. You actually need to understand the words here. So they're usually kept in the drawer. So we need to understand that we need to go to the sink rather than the drawer. So there's one word that if we didn't understand, we wouldn't be able to carry this out. There's loads of different cutlery in the sink. So we need to understand the knife and the spoon. We need to leave out those forks. So we need to understand the cutlery words. And big, the size. We need to understand big, or else if we didn't understand it, we might get a little teaspoon. That's not what we've been asked. So actually, this example is very different to the first one. We need to understand the actual words in order to carry it out. And we call these, when you have to understand the actual word in the sentence, we call this a key word. So just at the bottom there, these are the words in a sentence that you must understand to be able to carry it out. So in our reports, we might say that somebody's at 2 keyword level, 3 keyword level. And that's the number of words that they can understand in order to follow that out. When we assess somebody's verbal understanding, we strip away all those other environmental clues. So we need them to understand that verbal word alone. They can't pick up on any other environmental cues. So we strip those all away in our assessments. So it is kind of out of context. It's quite, kind of unusual, but it's just to remove those cues to see what number of words they understand in the actual sentence. Okay, so just a reminder, it is often not necessary to understand any words in order to know what is happening or what is expected. There are the other clues that people can pick up on. So situational understanding or non-verbal understanding. So all that gesture, the situation of hearing the table being set, smelling the food, all these other cues people can pick up on in understanding. So thinking back to the myths that Corinne spoke about right at the beginning, when people say they understand everything we say, just double check and take a minute to reflect on if you've said that, and that's absolutely fine. If you've said that, could there have been some of these environmental clues at the same time that they might have picked up on instead? Okay, so how do we know if someone doesn't understand? So again, take a minute with your service users, have a think. How have you picked up on, or why have you picked up on if you think somebody's struggling to understand what you're saying? What happens? Okay. So they might just not be able to carry out what you've asked them to do. They might do a different thing. So that's a good way of knowing that they've not understood what you've asked them to do. They might always choose the last option. So that's the last one that they've heard, and that's the one that they can remember. So they do that one. So just be aware, if you're giving them choices, do they always go for that last one? Because that could be a sign that they've not understood. They've just heard that last one and they're going to say that last one. Do they just repeat back what you've said to them? Do they just repeat back what you've said to them? So like those learnt phrases, they've not understood it. The actual content, they haven't understood it. They're just repeating it back. They know, oh, I've got to reply. I'm expected to say something. So they just repeat something rather than actually answering themselves. Behaviours that challenge. If somebody isn't understanding, that can get really frustrating. So it could present as a behaviour that challenges, especially in situations that are very verbal, they're heavily verbal. So if that's too much for the service user, they might display a behaviour that challenges. Unwillingness to answer open-ended questions. So if they're not understanding that question or what you're asking them, they might not want to answer it, or they might refuse to answer it. And finally, use of distraction techniques. So if somebody asks you a question or somebody says something to you that you don't understand, they might just go, oh yeah. And we sometimes do that, you know, if we've not completely caught what somebody said to us, sometimes we just go, oh yeah, hoping that that's enough and they've not actually asked us a direct question because we've not understood what they've said. We know we need to respond, so we might use that distraction technique instead. Okay, so again, just some general strategies that you might do already, and that's brilliant. General strategies that anybody can do. So be clear about what that person can understand. Have they been seen by us before? Dig that report out and see what keyword level they're up to. If they're up to 3 keyword level, make sure your sentences are quite short and they only have 3 keywords in. Use simple words. So don't use all the fancy words. So instead of saying a preference, could you just say like? What do they like? Keeping it nice and simple, using those words that you know they know. So avoid all the jargon. Using simple language, again, just exactly the same. Don't make it fancier than it needs to be. Use short sentences. So rather than saying, oh, come on, Alana, you need to get your coat on. We're going out to the shops. It's cold outside. It's raining. We're going to go for a walk. We'll have to wait for the bus. You could just say, get your coat on, Alana. We're going out. That's a lot easier to understand than the first example that was really long, and process it as well and take it in and act on it. Use the same word each time. So if you use the word toilet, always use the word toilet. Don't change it to the bathroom or the loo or the girls' room. Use that same word so it's consistent. So the more times they hear it, the more likely they're going to make that link and associate that word with that thing. Use your facial expression, your tone of voice, your body language, all those non-verbal means of communication as well. Like Alana said, 93% of communication is non-verbal, so it's really important that you use all those things as well. Offering concrete choices is really helpful. So if they've not understood what you've said, if you then had an apple and an orange in front of them, they can maybe understand those objects right in front of them rather than understanding all the language around it. So concrete choices. Do you want this cereal or do you want this toast? But giving them choices. Using signs. So we'll talk about Makaton a little bit later, but using signs can help with the verbal communication. So verbal communication, you know, it comes and goes. We say it and it's gone. But a sign is more visual and we can keep it there. We can do it again. So it's easier to understand. And it might be that the visual sign is easier to understand than the verbal word for someone. Again, using pictures, photos, objects, again, they're more concrete, they last longer than just that word. And use all means of available. So if you're talking about something in the kitchen, can you point to things? Can you go over to the cupboard? If you're talking about something in the fridge, can you open the fridge and show them what's in the fridge? If you're talking about family members, so who questions. If you've got photos around, can you point to the photos? Oh, do you mean them? Do you mean them? So using everything that's around to help them understand. Okay, so we've got a little example from Friends, just about tone of voice. So we've spoken about tone of voice and how important it is to use all those non-verbal means of communication. But tone of voice, if we think about somebody who isn't understanding those verbal words, they might be picking up on the tone of voice. So if we just watch this video of Ross and see what we think about this video. Hopefully it works. Is it not working, Alana?
No.
No.
Not.
Well, a good example, this is just what Ross is doing. A good example, which I'm sure we all do, is when we just say, I'm fine, I'm fine. You know, from the tone of voice, we know you're not fine, but the actual words, you're saying, I'm fine. But it's the tone of voice that kind of tells you actually the kind of the content of that expression. So be aware when you're talking to your service users, be aware of your tone of voice. So if they're not understanding every word that you use, they might be picking up on that tone of voice. So keep your tone of voice reflecting what you're saying. So if you're happy, use a happy tone of voice, and they might pick up on that and they might reflect that. So yeah, just be aware of your tone of voice. I think this is just another example of tone of voice. Oh. Okay, so in that video, at first, Phoebe's tone of voice didn't reflect how she was feeling. You know, she was quite happy with Ross, but actually she wasn't happy with him. But then as the video went on, her tone of voice and her body language really kind of supported her verbal message that she wasn't happy with Ross. She was turning her body away from him. She had obviously the magazine in front of her face. So the tone of voice and the body language really supported she wasn't happy with Ross. Even though she's never said why she's not happy with him, we knew from her tone of voice and body language she wasn't happy with him. That's a nice example. Okay, and this is very similar. So the use of body language and facial expression. So just as I mentioned with Phoebe, body language such as turning away, not looking at someone, can really impact on someone's communication. So we'll just watch this one and have a think about this one afterwards, if it works. Okay, so in that one, Ross didn't say anything. Didn't say anything at all, but from his body language that he froze and his facial expression with his mouth open, his wide eyes, we knew that he was shocked, and that it was kind of new information for him. So Ross did not need to say anything verbal, but we knew exactly how he was feeling from his body language and his facial expression in there. Okay. Oh, is there another one? Sorry. Okay. So at the beginning, Ross was saying my sister, but his tone of voice, his body language, we knew that he was really angry. And right at the end, just then, he said exactly the same, my sister and my best friend. But the whole tone of voice around it changed the meaning of it completely. So the same words, but the difference of the tone of voice made it a completely different meaning and expression, if that makes sense. So after watching those videos, just consider the tone of voice that you use, your body language, your facial expression. 93% of that, communication, 93% is non-verbal. So it's really important that all of those other non-verbal things are in tune with what you are saying. So after those videos, we're going to stop the recording now, and then the second part of the training is going to be in another recording. So if you start the next recording whenever you're ready, and we'll stop this one now.